We break into this hour with frantic reports of a subterranean coup unfolding behind the heavy silk drapes of Buckingham Palace, where the foundational pillars of the sovereign state are suffering a catastrophic seismic shock. 4 minutes ago, a clandestine private message breached the palace's highest security perimeter, landing directly upon the mahogany desk of King Charles, carrying with it a demand so audacious it threatens to dismantle centuries of sovereign order and tear the House of Windsor apart. Absolute power is currently under siege, not by external adversaries, but through a deeply personal, cold-blooded maneuver orchestrated from across the Atlantic. The gilded doors of the royal estate have slammed shut, senior courtiers speak in terrified, breathless whispers, and the sovereign stands alone against an unprecedented attempt to seize the throne's spiritual legitimacy. Inside the quiet sanctuary of his private study, bathed in the dim amber glow of desk lamps, the king stared down at the sheet of parchment, his hands trembling with a sudden, icy rage. The atmosphere hung thick with the suffocating weight of history and unspoken regret. Charles read the forbidden lines once, then twice, the agonizing silence broken only by the rhythmic, heavy ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like the countdown to an empire's collapse. The missive was not a humble plea for familial peace. It was a calculated ultimatum. Meghan had not merely asked for permission to return to royal duties. She had presented herself under a wholly forbidden ceremonial designation, asserting a title that palace authority had strictly, privately prohibited from ever being used again. The words burned into the paper: Diana's royal successor. To the monarch, this wording was far more than a breach of rigid palace protocol. It was an act of ruthless psychological warfare and symbolic treason. For years, the calculating forces outside the monarchy had watched for a moment of institutional vulnerability, preparing to strike at the heart of the crown. By weaponizing the untouchable memory of the late Princess of Wales, Meghan sought to hijack Diana's eternal public reverence, converting a dead woman's tragedy into raw political leverage. The demands were relentless: immediate, unrestricted entry to the ancient fortress of Windsor, restored royal protection, a prominent public placement beside the senior bloodline, and formal recognition as the natural, living continuation of Diana's iconic legacy. It was an insidious attempt to conquer from within, using the one name the monarchy could never treat with indifference. The king slowly removed his gold-rimmed reading glasses, placing them beside the offending parchment with a deliberate, haunting stillness. He fixed his gaze upon the pale, trembling aide standing before him in the shadows. "That title will not enter this family," Charles murmured, his voice deadly quiet, laced with absolute, unyielding finality. The monarch's wrath was immediate and total. He ordered palace officials to trace every single hand that had touched the document, demanding to know if Harry had sanctioned this brazen language, if Meghan had acted independently, or if a traitorous cabal inside the royal household had aided the subversion. The chilling suspicion of an internal mole transformed the palace mood instantly into one of deep paranoia and lockdown. Before an official denial could even be drafted, the forbidden text reached Prince William at Kensington Palace. The heir to the throne unsealed the folder, his eyes falling directly upon the phrase that sought to claim his mother's identity. In an instant, his expression hardened into stone. William dismissed his waiting staff with a sharp gesture, remaining entirely alone in the suffocating silence of his study. For William, this was no longer a political dispute over royal status or calendar appearances. It was a deeply personal desecration. The legacy of his mother belonged neither to opportunistic outsiders nor to political bargaining tables. His hands tightly gripped the edges of the desk, his jaw set in a rigid line, as the true heroic defender of Diana's memory prepared to rise against the scheming cabal threatening to hollow out the crown. The board was set, and the shadow war for the realm's soul had officially begun. Behind the forbidden title stood 4 figures locked in an inevitable collision of history, grief, and raw ambition. Charles carried the heavy burden of a past marriage defined by scandal and public judgment, fiercely desperate to maintain the sacred order of his reign. William stood as the unyielding guardian of his mother's purity, sworn to crush any attempt to commercialize her spirit. Across the ocean, driven by a dark determination to rewrite her narrative of exile, Meghan viewed the title not as theft, but as her righteous birthright, a weapon of survival against an unyielding institution. And caught helplessly between them was Harry, trapped in the lethal crossfire between his duty to his wife and his sacred obligation to his brother. The forbidden words that now threatened to shatter the monarchy were not born in a sudden moment of madness. They had been forged months earlier in the shadowy, high-ceilinged conference rooms of Kensington Palace. Long before the private message reached the king's desk, the seeds of this royal war had been planted during a clandestine planning session for a Diana Memorial Initiative. What was ostensibly framed as a benevolent project dedicated to homelessness and vulnerable children was secretly a battleground for the soul of the crown's legacy. Meghan had entered that fateful meeting convinced her proposal would serve as an unassailable bridge back into the royal fold, a return disguised as selfless humanitarian service. She believed the monarchy could not publicly reject an initiative wrapped in the mantle of Diana's historic compassion. Yet Prince William, watching from across the long conference table, perceived something far more sinister. To the heir to the throne, the proposal was an insidious strategy to transform a mother's sacred memory into a marketable political commodity. The tension in the room grew suffocating as a senior courtier began reading the written draft aloud, his voice echoing off the ancient oak walls. When the official reached the fateful phrase characterizing Meghan as a modern continuation of Diana's compassionate mission, the Prince of Wales reached the absolute point of no return. William slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, cutting the courtier off mid-sentence with an icy, terrifying authority. "No living member of this family will be presented as her successor," William declared, his voice trembling with a controlled, lethal rage. "Not Meghan, not Catherine, not even her sons." The rejection hit the room like a physical blow. In that heavy, unbroken silence, two irreconcilable visions of history solidified. Meghan felt the cold sting of an institution protecting its monopoly over a dead princess's image, while William stood as a fiercely defensive son, refusing to allow his mother's identity to be inherited, packaged, or claimed as leverage for royal status. In the background, recorded conversations preserved the private fury that spilled over into Harry's world, leaving the younger prince paralyzed between his wife's ambition and his brother's unyielding boundary. As rumors of the Kensington Palace clash reached the king, Queen Camilla quietly intervened behind closed doors. Standing in the shadow of the sovereign's private quarters, the queen consort issued a stern, calculated warning to her husband. She urged Charles not to act out of raw temper, cautioning that a brutal, heavy-handed rejection would inadvertently transform Meghan's forbidden title into a powerful symbol of martyr-like resistance. Yet Charles, haunted by the ghost of a marriage that had brought the crown to its knees decades ago, could not allow his fragile authority to be mocked. The king took up his pen and signed a secret, binding palace directive. The decree officially outlawed phrases such as Diana's successor, Diana's heir, and the new Diana across every royal office, communications team, and ceremonial program in the realm. The instruction was absolute, confidential, and final. When Meghan subsequently presented the forbidden title in her formal request, she openly crossed the line the king had drawn in blood. What was meant to be a delicate negotiation instantly erupted into a high-stakes confrontation inside the monarch's private quarters. There were no flashing cameras, no public fanfare, and no ceremonial robes. Only a monarch determined to crush a rebellion and a challenger refusing to submit. Charles sat across from Meghan, a single printed document separating them on the polished desk. For minutes, neither moved. Then, the king slowly pushed the page across the wood, his eyes locking onto hers with deadly intensity. "Explain to me why you have used a title I personally forbade," Charles demanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the crushing weight of the crown. Meghan did not flinch. She asserted that the title was not an act of theft, but a badge of survival, a reflection of the courage required to resist the very same institutional cruelty that had once hunted Diana. But the king's patience had vanished. Leaning forward, he delivered a line that cut through the romanticized illusion like a razor. "You do not inherit her name because you suffered inside this family." The psychological pressure in the room escalated to a suffocating crescendo. Charles accused her of weaponizing private suffering to extort royal security, access, and international status. In response, Meghan slid the request back across the table, refusing to strip the title unless the palace yielded to her terms. Then came the ultimate escalation, a subtle, terrifying revelation that a public version of the manifesto had already been drafted and placed in the hands of a covert communications ring outside the palace walls. If negotiations broke down, the forbidden designation would be leaked to the global press, unleashing an uncontainable public storm. Charles stood up, his face pale with fury, and closed the folder with a sharp, decisive snap. The negotiation was dead. The king opened the door to end the meeting, only to reveal Prince William waiting silently in the hallway outside, ready to strike. As Meghan stepped out into the dim, marble-lined corridor of Buckingham Palace, the heavy oak doors of the king's study clicked shut behind her with a sound like a tomb closing, sealing off any remaining hope of institutional compromise. But the true emotional reckoning of the day was not over. It was waiting in the cold, cavernous shadows of the inner gallery. Prince William stood at the far end of the private passage, silent, unyielding, and completely motionless. He carried no briefing papers, held no executive folders, and was accompanied by no lingering advisors. For years, their escalating war had been fought through proxies, press leaks, and carefully scrubbed official statements. Now, for the first time in an agonizing eternity, the future monarch faced the woman who had sought to seize his mother's sacred title, with nothing between them but decades of unhealed scars, unspoken resentments, and the crushing weight of royal destiny. William possessed no crown that day, yet his towering, solemn presence radiated an undeniable, terrifying authority. Charles had confronted her as the sovereign defending legal protocol and state order, but William stood before her as an eldest son protecting the holy sanctuary of his mother's memory. The Prince of Wales spoke without raising his voice, every word falling like an iron gavel in the quiet corridor. He declared with absolute, ruthless precision that he would never support any arrangement linking her return to Diana's former charities, ceremonial objects, public memorials, or private residences. He flatly refused to permit her access to the household he shared with Catherine, drawing an impenetrable wall around his family. "She was my mother before she was ever a symbol for your public campaigns," William said, his voice quiet, trembling slightly with suppressed grief and icy anger. "Her memory is not a title to be awarded, marketed, inherited, or used as political leverage for royal status." Meghan held her ground, her jaw set in rigid defiance, refusing to step back under the heavy, piercing stare of the future king. She countered sharply that pain, isolation, and persecution were not the exclusive property of a prince. She insisted that the systemic isolation, media hostility, and institutional cruelty she had endured inside the palace gates mirrored the exact crucible Diana had faced, giving her every moral right to claim continuity with Diana's humanitarian crusade against an uncaring machine. But William rejected the comparison with lethal, terrifying clarity. Shared suffering, he told her, did not bestow royal authority, nor could private grief be transformed into a bargaining chip to negotiate international security, palace access, and royal power. Grief could foster understanding, but it could never forge a crown. With a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to stop time itself, William reached out and picked up the palace visitor pass resting in Meghan's hand. Without a single word, he placed it on a nearby antique console table. The gesture was quiet, almost delicate, yet its meaning reverberated through the grand gallery like a thunderclap. Her access to the realm was officially revoked. She was now entirely excluded from the sovereign domain. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. William revealed that he had already issued a binding, institution-wide review, commanding every royal foundation, commercial entity, and public trust to scrub her name from any association with Princess Diana. The entire machinery of the British state was moving in unison to enforce her exile. The administrative retaliation was instantaneous and devastatingly thorough. Within hours, Every avenue Meghan had attempted to open was systematically dismantled by silent, bureaucratic decrees. Her planned summit at Windsor Castle vanished from the master calendar. Her commemorative appearances were flatly rejected, and her formal application to join the Diana Memorial Initiative was permanently purged from official records. Security details were instructed that no future public movement by Meghan could ever be described as royal, semi-royal, or connected to Diana's historic mantle. Charles ratified the total collapse of her campaign by signing a binding palace directive. The decree officially declared that Meghan possessed no ceremonial or constitutional link to Diana's legacy, while drawing a brutal line in the sand for Prince Harry. Private family contact could remain, but no conversation would ever restore official duties, security privileges, or titles. In a quiet, dimly lit sitting room, far from the throne room's grand arches, Meghan read the final paragraph of the King's directive twice, her fingers trembling as the cold reality of total defeat set in. Lowering the letter, she walked toward the window, telling Harry that the palace had chosen cruel punishment over reconciliation. Harry stood in the shadows, trapped between his devotion to his wife and the sacred memory of his mother, realizing with tragic clarity that the forbidden title had crossed a line that could never be repaired. With the sovereign institution removed from the room and the palace doors locked tight, husband and wife were finally left alone in the heavy, suffocating silence to confront what the forbidden title had truly cost them. Harry waited until the frantic phone calls stopped, the encrypted devices fell silent, and the legal advisors had vacated the private suite. Then, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, he placed Meghan's drafted public announcement on the table between them. For once, there was no scripted media strategy, no furious debate over security details, and no blame cast upon palace prejudice or constitutional cruelty. There were only two deeply exhausted souls, weathered by years of unrelenting combat against an unyielding empire. Harry looked down at the forbidden words attached to his mother's sacred memory and voiced the terrifying truth he had avoided saying for years. Defending his wife did not require him to accept that she had become Diana's rightful successor. To Meghan, those words felt like an unforgivable betrayal from the one person who had sworn to protect her through every ordeal. For years, Harry had nurtured the comparisons, drawing direct parallels between the relentless hostility faced by his wife and the historic persecution that had hounded his mother. But the brutal showdown inside Buckingham Palace had forced the younger prince to confront the sharp, dangerous line between honoring a mother's suffering and usurping her identity. Harry insisted that the forbidden phrase had to be removed immediately and the planned public leak permanently aborted. Supporting their future, he told her, meant breaking the vicious cycle of generational trauma, not endlessly sacrificing their lives on the altar of Diana's tragedy. Looking into his eyes, Meghan saw the painful sincerity beneath his plea. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the prepared manifesto and tore the first page in half, the sound echoing through the room like the severing of a historic tie. As the anger dissipated into a heavy, tragic grief, Meghan admitted the bitter truth she had fought so hard to deny. Part of her desperate crusade to force a royal return was driven by a burning need to prove that leaving the monarchy had not rendered her irrelevant. Yet the withdrawal of the draft came far too late to halt the global catastrophe already gathering outside the palace gates. By nightfall, fragments of the rejected proposal and the forbidden title had leaked to high-level media networks, igniting a ravenous public war that swept across the globe. Scheduled television broadcasts were abruptly interrupted by breaking news flashes, while headlines roared with wild speculation over the subterranean war inside the royal family. A national newspaper printed a stark, haunting front cover, an entirely black page split between a portrait of Princess Diana and one of Meghan, anchored by 5 chilling words in bold type. A legacy, not a title. Outside Kensington Palace, solemn crowds gathered under the gray skies, laying white roses at the historic memorial gates. One handwritten card left among the blooms captured the heart of the national mood. Let her be remembered, not replaced. Inside the palace, despite intense pressure from senior courtier factions to issue a crushing public rebuke, King Charles chose restraint over public humiliation. The monarch received a confidential briefing confirming that Meghan had formally withdrawn the forbidden title and halted the media campaign. Rather than seeking a public execution of his son's lingering reputation, the king signed a final, binding royal resolution. The sovereign permanently closed every open request, barring any future return under titles, duties, or roles connected to Diana's memory, while leaving the delicate thread of private family contact intact. William watched the storm subside from the quiet solitude of his study. He had secured the absolute boundary he had fought to protect, ensuring his mother's identity could never be commodified, inherited, or used as a weapon of political leverage. The ultimate curtain had fallen on the battle for the crown's spiritual legacy. The forbidden title was permanently erased from palace ledgers, the heavy gates of Windsor remained firmly closed, and the ambitious campaign to claim a dead princess's mantle collapsed into historical dust. In the end, the tragic struggle exposed the unyielding power of an ancient institution that absorbs every challenge, protects its sanctified past, and buries the ambitions of those who attempt to seize its soul. Royal roles would adapt, titles would pass down through bloodlines, and public passions would inevitably fade. But personal memory could never be conquered or claimed as authority. Diana's immortal legacy belonged neither to Meghan, nor Charles, nor the palace machine. It belonged forever to the world she touched and to the sons who carried her loss.
There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to claim, and no title powerful enough to reopen the royal door that had finally closed forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.